Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome everyone to Congregation Kadima Torah Moshe. My name is Rabbi Yonah Berman. I'm the rabbi of this synagogue, and I feel quite honored tonight to be able to introduce a number of people. I'm just standing over here so that I can be in the webcam's view, because I really like Rabbi Linzer and Ann and these wonderful people. We're being joined tonight not just by people who are in this room, this nice full room, but we're joined by people throughout the United States and around the world who are joining us on a live webcast, and the broadcast is being taped as well, so people can watch it in the future on YouTube. I will remind everyone that this event was originally supposed to take place exactly 1 month ago, with 1 hour off because of the clock change. Thankfully, there has been less snow than there was, although certainly you got to see some snow as you came in tonight as well. And we're glad that you were able to make it and to join us tonight, both you and Rabbi Klapper, a little closer to home for you. But thank you both for coming on a weeknight and joining us here at Kadima for this wonderful event. I'm simply going to introduce very briefly the three people who we have in front of us tonight, and then they will take it away and I will sit back and enjoy the show along with everyone else who's here. All the way on the left, we have Rabbi Aryeh Klapper. Rabbi Aryeh Klapper is the founder of the Center for Modern Torah Leadership, someone who many of the people in this room know from the various places in which he instructs and teaches Torah in the larger Boston community, whether through the kollel that he runs in Sharon every summer, which at various points has taken place in partnership with our congregation, whether through his involvement in the Boston Beitin, whether through his being someone who is seen in the community as a Rav who is respected, as a posek and someone who people go to with difficult questions, certainly something that will come up tonight in conversation. He is joined, of course, by Rabbi Linzer, who's joining us, the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshiva Chovevei Torah Rabbinical School, and now involved as well as part of that in the Lindenbaum Center for Judaic Studies, for Halachic Studies as well in the Yeshiva. Linzer is someone who I've gotten to know as a Talmid, and as someone who I've been able, since I've been in the field as a rabbi, to call on numerous times with questions, with all sorts of things to have a conversation about, whether it is to do with halacha, hashkafa, psak. As part of that, as well, a year ago, our congregation was very fortunate to have Rabbi Linzer as a scholar in residence. And what I can say about both of our speakers tonight is that they're both individuals, and we saw this with Rabbi Linzer when he was here last year, and we've seen this with Rabbi Klapper on many occasions when he's been with us as well. These are both individuals who are not just Talmidei Chachamim, but they are incredibly sensitive Talmidei Chachamim. They're individuals who understand a sense of nuance, a sense of the philosophy and the hashkafa behind halacha as well. And they're individuals who are warm and receptive and able to deal with the complicated issues facing Am Yisrael. So it's a pleasure to welcome them both. And it's also a pleasure to welcome Ann Geller, who feels funny welcoming Ann Geller because this shul is so much about the work that Ann and people like Ann do in terms of volunteering. I'm sorry. It's true. Doing 4-hour shul. Ann is someone who is very involved in various committees in our shul. She's someone who has a PhD in philosophy from the University of Toronto. She's someone who, together with her husband David, are a wonderful part of our community and good friends, I'll say personally, to Rachel and myself and to Leif. And Ann will be moderating tonight, so I'm going to sit down and enjoy along with you. Please, Ann will explain the format first, and please enjoy.
Okay, I just want to begin by saying how honored we at KTM are to be able to host the first of these dialogues between Rabbi Klapper, Rabbi Linzer. You should pick up the form, which reminds me you should pick up the flyers for the second one, which is April 14th at Harvard Hillel.
We'll be doing your taxes for you afterwards.
So this is the first of a series of 4. The last 2 will be in New York. I'm sure you'll be able to find out where those are too. In my experience, Rabbi Linzer, Rabbi Klapper are both incredible scholars and amazing teachers, and I'm really looking forward to a dialogue between them. So our topic tonight is, when can one pasken for oneself? The aim is not a cut and dry answer, but to examine the parameters of what's involved in an answer. The more I thought about this question, this wonderful question, the more I realized how much it raises the most fundamental questions about halachic life. What does it mean to ask a shaila and to give an answer to Pasken? If I research an issue, is that sufficient? And if not, what more is needed? What does one need a rabbi for? Is Paskening more than knowing the ins and outs of a halachic issue? Is there then a relation between values and law? And how do we see this connection? Fundamentally, what do we do when we follow halacha? Is it a matter of submitting our will to another heteronomous authority, a rabbi, a Kadosh Baruch Hu, or is it also, in part at least, empowering ourselves to incorporate halacha into our daily lives? And are we asking these questions in the terms that we do because we're modern people? So that's what we'll be addressing tonight. The format will be Rabbi Klapper and Rabbi Linzer will each give a statement of their approach to this question. You will get a question or two after each of you makes your statements. Then we'll look at least one issue, one example of how their articulated frameworks play out in practice. The idea is not to come to a decision on any issue, but to enjoy the dialogue. And then we'll open to your questions. So we're thinking about an hour and a quarter, and we can, go longer if you have more questions.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much to KTM. This is always a wonderful place to come learn Torah because of the involvement, intensity, and both knowledge and seriousness of the audience. I thank Rabbi Berman for listening in for his introduction. And as I told Dan, after so many years of participating in events that she has been behind the scenes, it is wonderful to finally have the opportunity to make her an internet star. Also, very grateful to Rabbi Linzer for agreeing to come up. These are always the conversations I have with Rabbi Linzer are always things that I enjoy and remember for years. And I also think that it's really valuable for modern Orthodoxy for part of what would really generate a deeply vibrant halachic religious community is if we can not only agree but challenge each other and disagree. So I'm hoping we get both of these this evening, that you'll get to see the points of agreement, but that also both the audience and we will challenge each other. And the Torah will expand, but also will expand the boundaries and deepen the community. I want to start by framing the issue that by setting out two hypothetical ideal halachic communities. In one ideal halachic community, all Jews are sufficiently learned to have the intellectual capacity to ascertain the meanings of legal texts. Everybody knows Aramaic. Everybody knows how to learn Gemara and can state back the Shakla of the Gemara and the Tosfot and decode the codes, and not only that, knows how to apply them to actual situations. Everyone, therefore, paskens for him or herself. In this vision, every Jew is autonomous within the human framework and bound only by their own understandings of the Ratzon Hashem, of the will of God, as revealed in Torah. Right? This is me saying that Hashem Rabbanim. Right? Could it be that every Jew in the Jewish people was a rabbi? And that's really our ultimate vision: is every human being is fully autonomous and has a direct relationship with God, and anything which moves away from that is a b'diavad, it's a concession. You might think of this as the Rousseau model of halakha. And there's a countervision. The countervision is no matter how learned the Jewish community becomes, there will still be some people who are more learned and some people who are less learned. The purpose of halachic life is to always make the best possible decision and do really what God wants. Therefore, no matter how learned you become, if you had the opportunity, you should ask somebody more learned. Not only that, a central feature of halachic life is the experience of heteronomy, of submission. So really, the ultimate religious act is to be able to ask your she'elot constantly. Now, there are practical reasons that won't happen. Because the most learned person will rapidly become the least learned person because they'll get no sleep and no time to learn and everything like that. but really, any circumstance in which you paskin for yourself, unless you are the most learned person in the world, is b'diavad, because somebody other than the best person is making the decision. Right? Those are your two outlying ideals. I think there is truth to each of them, and the question is how we navigate the values. Because I think that on the one hand, the experience of heteronomy is real. I think that, as opposed to Rousseau, that Torah perhaps starts to some degree with, you might say an Aristotelian presumption, I'm not really up on it, that we assume that the natural condition of human beings is community. And on the other hand, I think that part of being creative at Tselem Elokim is the capacity to be creative in Torah, and the capacity and the experience of controlling your own destiny. And a more powerful way, I would say that Rabbi Soloveitchik says that the purpose of human beings is to imitate God. The first thing that God does is create. The thing that is unique to Jews is Torah. So the job of a Jew is to be creative in Torah, but not all of us are going to be spectacular intellectuals, right? But the way in which we each create our own interpretation of Torah is by the way we establish our priorities within Torah. Right? Whether we decide to focus on Gemilut Chassidim or on Talmud Torah, and where Gemilut Chassidim, all those sorts of issues. So, right, if there is no space for people to make those kinds of decisions, then you're not really being fully human. So it can't be that the ideal is for every decision to be made by somebody else. Right? So those are the poles that I want to navigate in between. Then there is within those poles, there's the question of what's a minimal standard. What are the kinds of questions that genuinely constitute paskening for yourself? What are the issues that are community issues where it would be irresponsible to make a decision for yourself which affects others? How is it possible to hold the community together without some kind of formal authority structure? Those are all challenging issues. But the overall framework I want to say is that I think that I don't think this is uniquely modern. I think that part of the drive for Jews to learn Torah has always been the capacity, to some extent, to be autonomous and to run your life according to your serious understanding of Torah. But at the same time, the notion that halakha does not value the experience of heteronomy seems to be strongly overstated. And the challenge in figuring out whether you can paskin for yourself is figuring out how you can live a life that both implements the value of autonomy and your experience of being a participant in the creation of Torah, along with the experience of being part of the community that's bound by law, and of recognizing that the purpose of Torah is to be oseret samchat kirtzono, to make your will like God's will, and only afterwards to see if it turns out that he has made his will like yours.
Thank you. Let me start also by saying what a pleasure it is to be here and also to be sharing this venue with Rabbi Klapper. And in the spirit of exactly the issue that was raised about multiple voices, I want to just mention that recently Rabbi Klapper on his website for his remind me the
Center for Monetary Leadership.
Center for Monetary Leadership posted a very provocative essay on a certain very cutting-edge topic. But what most impressed me was the way that Rabbi Klapper solicited multiple responses from a wide range of people and really held the whole conversation in a respectful tone of reciprocal respect. And I think that that's really a model of what we have to be working together as a community, and that I hope that we're also embodying here. And I think as in the words that I'm going to share, we'll see that why I think sometimes it's fun when the two of us get together, because the very different ways that we approach the same question. And whereas Rabbi Klapper sort of took things from a philosophical perspective, my initial response to this question was a much more practical one about the issues on the ground. Maybe it has to do with the fact that we're putting out rabbis and we're dealing with the practical issues on the ground. And so let me share with you my reflections on this. My initial response to when can you paskin for yourself is, well, you can paskin for yourself when you know what the halacha is. When you know, I mean, even for me, when do I paskin for myself? I paskin for myself. If there's something that I feel that I have enough knowledge, enough information, or enough ways to find the relevant information. I know enough how to weigh the issues. I know enough about the process. I also feel relatively confident that I'm not going to be nogea b'davar. I won't have too much of a personal vested interest. And sometimes that's actually the opposite way. Sometimes I will actually feel that I'm going to be too machmir for myself, so I'll ask somebody else to paskin for me. So I get the fact that really I should be giving myself. And so same issue with everybody else. If people have the relevant knowledge and know enough about the methodology and the process, it's really having smicha isn't some magic power to paskin, but it shows that person has developed, broadly speaking, that the body of knowledge and the process, but it's possible that people can have that in local cases. And by the way, we paskin for ourselves all the time. Every time we make a decision about, oh my gosh, I forgot Yala B'Yava, do I have to go back? Do I have to do this? Do I have to do that? I mean, all the time we paskin for ourselves and all the things that we know. Part, of course, of the problem with that is that you don't know enough. You don't know what you don't know, and you don't know that you don't maybe have the knowledge to be aware that a certain thing is a question, or you don't understand enough how to arrive at the right answer. Just a little example for this, and I even know some rabbis who have made this mistake. Not aware that somebody has a baby boy, 8th day, it's Shabbos, you do a bris milah. Never learned the halacha that if it was born by cesarean section, you don't do it on Shabbos. So if you never learned that halacha, you never realize there's a shaila, you're going to go ahead and do it on Shabbos, and you won't know that you don't know. So the simple answer is that we have to look case by case in terms of, do you have enough knowledge to apply? Do you know enough about the process to apply? Do you have enough way to be sort of impartial and sufficiently? And do you actually know when you should be asking questions? But that's a very, I would say, sort of maybe boring, pragmatic answer to that question. But let me now turn to a different perspective. And that's why I think we're asking this question, here tonight, and what I sort of see going on in terms of the broader community around this issue about paskin for oneself, and where we should be striving, what we think is the ideal for us as lay people and as rabbis. I tend to see, I would say, people that fall on both ends of the spectrum. Plenty of people have absolutely no interest, I would say the majority, have absolutely no interest in being involved in the process. So they don't have to pick up a phone every second. They want to know what to do, but they have no interest in actually owning the process of psak. Even if the rabbi tries to engage them, they say, well, let's talk about it. Let's tell you that. Rabbi, just tell me what to do. Okay? And that's most of it. Just tell me what to do. That's all I want to know. Just tell me what to do. I'm not interested at all in the process. Just tell me give me my marching orders. I'll do them. And then there are people at the other end of the spectrum. And at the other end of the spectrum are people that I think have an ideological opposition to turning to a rabbi for psak. That they actually feel that this issue of heteronomy, and I'm going to get back to heteronomy to whom, but the issue of rabbi having authority over me rather than me sort of self-directing myself in the process, they have ideologically opposed, or if not ideologically opposed, but there's a sense that that the rabbi really doesn't understand, will not be properly sharing my values, my perspective, my sensibility, and therefore, the answer he's going to give is really not relevant to my life. I have to make this decision for myself, and are specifically, very opposed to, or in principle or in practice, turning to the rabbi. Those are the two extremes. Now, why? Let's understand for a moment the first extreme. That just tell me what to do. Where's that coming from? I don't think. I'm generalizing here. I don't think it's coming from people that say, my religious value is in submission to authority, and therefore I just want to say, tell me what to do, so I can do the supreme act of my will, and that will be why I just tell the rabbi, just tell me and I'll listen. I actually think that where it's coming from is a lack of religious investment. It's basically, look, I am Orthodox, that's my identity. I go to an Orthodox show, I send my kids to an Orthodox school, I keep halacha. I don't want to invest too much of my more than that in terms of my religious, emotional, intellectual energy in the process. I just want to do what I need to do in order for, where my commitments lie in terms of my identity and so on. So just tell me, more the interest than that I don't have. That actually a lot of that just comes because that's the degree of my investment. So I think that we have to work at moving away from both of those extremes. I think that those that are asking, just tell me what to do, there has to be a point that, there is your religious has to be more than just just let me know the details. The religious engagement has to be something I'm seeing myself here, my rabbi, not just as a posek, but as an educator, and you should be turning to the rabbi in that capacity, and you should be more in the process. Now, it might depend what type of issue we're talking about. There are many areas where look, I love learning, and I love learning halacha, and I think it's fascinating, and it's religiously inspiring. But I don't think most people are religiously inspired by conceptual discussion or whether I have to kasher my spoon or not. And I think that there are a lot of areas where really the proper religious orientation is mission, doing what you need to do. I don't think we should get into a lot of conversations about Pesach. Particularly, there are areas where that is our primary goal, to make sure that we're doing everything right. That's really our only goal. And those issues come up in Kasher, Pesach, and Avelos. I would say those are the main areas. People really there, particularly Pesach and Kasher, particularly Pesach and Avelos, their primary point is not about a deeper religious engagement, but I want to make sure that when I'm doing this for my father that passed, my mother that passed away, that I am doing everything exactly the way I need to do. I want to know that when it comes to Pesach, I'm doing everything the way I need to do, and that maybe is appropriate. But then there are other areas which are much more value-laden, where we should be specifically engaging and encouraging conversation around those issues. One of the areas we'll get to, I won't talk about it now, but let's talk about questions about business ethics, about child rearing, about dealing with parents, kibbut avim issues. Those tend not to be the questions people most often ask rabbis, but those are the ones exactly that we should not be about to tell me what to do, but it should really be about engagement much more at a deeper level about what's involved. In terms of the other extreme, about the rejection, we have to own the fact that part of this whole problem of heteronomy, the flip side of it, is the power issue. Particularly nowadays, where we have seen how rabbinic power can be abused, and the type of abuses that come as a result of people just embracing the power dynamic and not feeling uncomfortable about it, is something that I think that we have to be, own as a community and understand that there's a deep problem. And the fact that even when it's not tragic cases, but rabbis just not being sufficiently responsive to congregants, to their issues, that leads to this type of disillusionment and estrangement. And therefore, we really have to work about moving away from both of those extremes. The people who say, Rabbi, just tell me what to do. The answer is, I'm not, for a lot of things I will just tell you what to do, because I agree that should be the type, that should be our relationship to a certain area of halakha. But in other areas, I want to encourage you to be asking me questions, and I want to encouraging us to have a conversation, because those are actually issues which it's not good enough that you know what to do and you're following it. Those are issues that really is about my role as an educator, about you should be seeking out not just the specifics of halakha, but you should be seeking out religious guidance. And on the other end of the extreme, we have to acknowledge that how we have failed in terms of how we have certainly too easily bought into people that just say, tell me what to do. Great, I get to be the rabbi, I get to be the authority, and so on. And that how that power dynamic has led to a lot of distancing and estrangement. And therefore, what we have to do again by adopting much more of a role of engagement as an educator to bring people more into the conversation. So I'll leave it with this for now. I'm sure more will emerge as we go back and forth.
You want to spend a
Sure.
bit of time questioning each other about?
Yeah. So I guess the question I was interested in the business ethics example specifically. So what would be wrong? Is the problem in business ethics that people are just asking shaylos and doing the right thing in business, and we have this plague of excessive halachic, halachic punctiliousness in business ethics? And are people paskening for themselves in business ethics, or are they seeing business as wholly irrelevant? Business is a sphere which halacha can't really touch. So would you really be distressed if, in fact, people ask all their shayla in business ethics the way they do for Pesach, because they're not sufficiently invested? Why necessarily should business ethics require more personal investment than just doing the right thing as opposed to Pesach? Why should Pesach be a mechanical obedience?
Well, so if I wasn't clear, I think that there's a dual problem that people, most of the community, I think, just wants to know what to do, but the wanting to know what to do is limited to the areas where are not so much central to their real important life decisions. Maybe with the exception of end of life issues, because you want to make sure you're doing the right thing there, similar to the Avelos question. But other than that, I feel that people are not, by and large, we don't have the middle state, the middle position. We don't have sufficiently people that are looking for a halachic answer, but are engaging in a meaningful process. I think that in areas in which values are central. And so we can certainly argue whether we should have more of a discussion of religious values around Pesach and Kashrus and so on. But I guess what I'm saying is I'm not bothered by the fact that that's an area that we've chosen to just focus on observance, and that people adopt just tell me what to do and I'll do it, and that's their approach. What I am saying is that something in the area of business ethics, I don't think people are passing for themselves. I think people are ruling out of the realm of psak. And that's where I think that the problem lies. So meaning I don't see very few people in let me try to reframe this way. In the world you set up there, right? We, as people who have learned the sources and the methodology and capacity, we can imagine somebody who's like at the cusp of where we are. So like has a good amount of knowledge, a good amount of the ability to sort of weigh the issues, but maybe not to the degree that they can really be, have the same degree of proficiency as we do. And are they in a place that they should paskin for themselves? But I don't imagine, and again, maybe we'll hear from everybody here that I'm wrong. I don't imagine that most people here, that's what they think about in terms of paskin for themselves. I think that most people are thinking about that they just want to, they just want to know the answer and do it, and they want to do it with the minimal amount of investment, or with the answer that most sort of is tailored to their needs. And if that's what they want, they either just ask the rabbi and say, tell me what to do, or they look up some answer on the internet and they find the answer that's most convenient for them, and that's where they go. And both of those, whether they're pasking for themselves or asking the rabbi, reflect an approach of, I just want to do it with minimal investment, and I want to do it in a way that minimally makes my life difficult. And that's what I sort of see as the phenomenon out there, as opposed to the people that are basically rejecting the whole authority issue. But that's what I see, and that's the sort of phenomenon that I want to respond to. And I want to sort of talk about, there are areas in halacha where that is appropriate, but what we're doing is we're not sort of bringing religious values and halachic discussions to the area in our lives which should matter, because I think we're all making halacha too much about do's and don'ts and not enough about education and conversation. I don't know if that answered your question, if I'm clear about that, but let me actually turn and ask you a question. Which is the issue of heteronomy that you emphasized, right? This gets to the point I was making about rabbinic power, because why if somebody is poskening for him or herself, is that not heteronomous? The heteronomous to God's will. Why is it important to be heteronomous to a rabbi and to rabbinic power? And I think that without if you think that somebody will not be properly sort of submissive in the process of halacha, they'll always tailor halacha to their own interests. That's a different question. But if somebody is going to do a process with sort of integrity, then why isn't that exactly being submissive to God's will? Why is it important to have heteronomy towards a rabbi? And I can imagine that there are answers to that, but I think that we have to problematize that, because the whole issue of the power issue with rabbi and rabbinic authority and the types of abuses that we've seen, I think that if we're not problematizing that, we're missing a major issue here about what it's all about.
So I'm very glad you asked me that. And those who heard me before know that I have a deep suspicion of charisma. And one of the, I guess what I'm hearing you say that interests me is you didn't really set it up as an opposition between asking for yourself or asking a shiloh. The opposition you set up was having somebody paskin for you without challenging them and without investing anything of yourself to determine whether they are in fact giving the right answer, and having somebody paskin for you as the result of a dialogue in which you really invested yourself and spent time, and the other person really did a good job of getting to know you. I'm very not into a circumstance in which you constantly just, the reason I don't like the notion of you just ask somebody a shayla and they don't know, besides the fact that it's bad psak if you don't know the person, it also abdicates your own responsibility because you end up with just charismatics who give answers off the top having power, which I really don't like. I think that on the other hand, though, I don't think, and I think that as you pointed out, that that people who paskin for themselves often end up being way too machmir, not too makil. I'm not so worried that if people paskin for themselves, they will paskin in accordance with their interests. Right? People who spend their lives being serious about psak don't tend to be totally about self-interest. You have to have other values. But I think that you end up paskin entirely in accordance with your own values without challenging them. You end up in an echo chamber, in which really the text by itself. Always try and tell my students, texts can't defend themselves against you, really. Right? It's only the experience of dialogue with other people about what the meaning of those texts that enables the text to have some kind of genuine impact on you. So it seems to me that one of the purposes of asking Sheila is, as you build the patterns on which you'll make your decisions going forward, that there's a point in which somebody else has had real impact and is constantly having real impact to check yourself. And I think the other issue, which I think goes to the crisis of authority, is that in some way our community has to give some kind of premium to greater Torah knowledge in decision making, or the whole thing is a game. Right. So that's where I think I don't have in any way the experience of heteronomy I want is not that of an ignorant Jew coming and asking a question to a rabbi who might as well be a black box and saying what to do. But it's the experience of a very learned Jew who has come to a circumstance where they know in advance that the question of the right thing to do, and it's a safety issue, is not really the issue because they know there are at least two safe things to do. Right? The question is on a values level, which of them is the righter thing to do? Right? And that's where I think that having somebody else's value who themselves has been engaged in a constant process of developing their own Torah interpretation dialectic with their own soul and with the soul of people they trust, I think that's a really valuable experience, and that's the kind of heteronomy I'm going for. Heteronomy, which is just I surrender to some other human being the authority to decide what God wants. I don't think that's what God wants.
Right. So what you're describing as heteronomy is what I was getting at in terms of talking about, discussing real value issues with the rabbi, and that people aren't asking those shilas enough, and exactly why those have to be asked is exactly because those are about exploring value issues. I would just be very reluctant to term that as heteronomy, because heteronomy really is another person's sort of power over me, the power of an outside law, where what you're talking about right now, what I was talking about was a type of a engagement and challenging somebody's beliefs because you're voicing a different perspective is not the same as submitting to authority, which is, I think, certainly what, for me at least, the word heteronomy is suggestive of. So that's why I would really push back on that. I think that we've done too much in terms of submission to rabbinic authority, and that's, as I said, led to people being estranged from that and distancing themselves and in principle and practice rejecting it. And I think that the people that do buy in and are totally happy to just submit blindly to rabbinic authority are also missing the boat, and we shouldn't play into that. And again, I'm repeating what I said before, of religious life where I don't think it's problematic. There are other areas which we need to actually see our role not just as posting, but as educators, and do much more to create a broader reality of what religious life is. I guess I would say, it's interesting that, maybe I'll use it as a moment to comment on sort of what I sort of see as a challenge in terms of the modern Orthodox community. Maybe I'm a little bit off topic, but I don't think so, which is, I don't think, as I said, I like learning halacha. I can spend a lot of time discussing shachs and tazes about spoons and forks, okay? But I, at the same time, realize that for most people, that's not an interesting type of religious engagement, and I don't think that it has to be a type of religious engagement. I think we have a wide area of areas in which people can be religiously enriched and guided. But I also don't think it has to be in other areas of halacha. It certainly can be if halacha is the idea of translation of value into practical ways of our lives. But I can also say, if for example, you take Rambam, right? Rambam, okay, mastered all of Torah, but he basically said, I'm writing all the halacha so you can know the halacha, so you can spend your time on what really matters, which is studying philosophy. Or the Kabbalists, they spent their time in what really mattered to them, which was studying Kabbalah. And if somebody said, Rabbi, I don't want to engage in it, in the whole discussion, because halacha is my do's and don'ts, but that's not where I want to invest my religious energies. I would say, wonderful. You want to invest your religious energies in learning machshava and learning Tanakh. I'm not going to insist that you get into meaningful conversations about areas of halacha. I think our problem as a mono-Orthodox community is that the only language we know how to speak is the halachic language. And therefore, we that's really what people say in terms of what is their observance about. It's about halacha. We don't hear these other areas that are held an important place. And therefore, the opportunity to have religious discussions winds up being in these halachic areas. So again, I want to say I don't have a problem if people adopt just tell me what to do and I'll do it. If they're having meaningful sense of if the rabbis help, I don't need the rabbi to help them. But anyway, they're helping themselves or the rabbis helping them in terms of a sense of serious religious engagement. But what I find as the problem, as I said, is that it's just about halacha and it winds up just being about the do's and the don'ts and submitting to a sense of just tell me what to do. And I think that we have to work to change that.
So at the end of the day, and probably we should move on after this. Yeah. At the end of the day, I think we both agree that the best process is an engaged process. Where I would still push is, under what circumstances at the end of that process, somebody making the decision for themselves, and at what stage is I don't want Orthodox Jews to use Nuremberg defenses. My rabbi said X, and therefore I have no necessity. There's no necessity for me if my rabbi tells me to do things which are horribly immoral. But my rabbi told me, so it's never. I don't think it's ever supposed to be complete heteronomy that you have no responsibility. But I want to know at what point there is a value in saying, but you know what? At this one, you should make the decision, not me, because your experience, your judgment is such that unless it's obviously immoral to me, I'm deferring the power to you. On the other issue, which I think is really valuable, de Tocqueville said famously, that every important values conversation in America eventually becomes a legal question. So I think that all the other areas of religious engagement at some point should become halachic questions, whether the original conversation is about halacha or not. But at some point we have to decide, what Pesach should be, and what Tefillah should be, and what the relative priority of Pesach and Tefillah is. So even if so the conversation that someone has to relate to what we do, and whether you carry the conversation on a micro level, which is whether I can still use the spoon for milk pigs, or on a macro level as to the how do we handle issues of economic costs as opposed to the safety of But I think that in the end, religious engagement can't be divorced from halacha, and it shouldn't leave halacha as purely mechanical. Halacha is the area where we just submit to life, and our real religious life is in halacha. Is in hashkafa.
Okay, I think we're agreeing on that point, because I think that was a point I was trying to as well. Maybe we should move on, and maybe it'll be clearer.
Sure.
Some of the
Yeah, I think we should find a concrete example and see if you actually disagree.
Okay, well, one issue that we had discussed in preparation for this was the question about birth control. And people asked the rabbi questions about birth control. And my experience is that this is a perfect example for me about what I think has gone wrong. Because I'll just sort of say my take here, whether Rabbi Klapper will agree or not, we'll see. But in terms of the basic halacha of is that there's a lot of latitude to say that it's a positive mitzvah, and people can decide when they're going to fulfill that mitzvah, as long as they're being responsible about making sure that they're going to fulfill it at some time, and that they can use birth control, as long as eventually they're going to get around to fulfilling it. What has happened, though, is partly, I would say, in response to maybe the Holocaust and the idea of, what Rabbi Sharetti called the 614th mitzvah, and the application to, make sure you have big families, and a sense that people are, with a lot of sort of people in the mono-Orthodox community, are with their type of, values about ambition and professional, accomplishment and so on. They're going to make decisions that are not value aligned with the type of, family first type of values that have been traditional Jewish values. And therefore, as a result, rabbis wind up saying, they don't tell people that's the halacha. What they wind up saying is actually, if you want to use birth control, because they don't trust you to make the responsible decision and what your values are, if you want to use birth control, you have to come to me for a hectare, and I'm going to allow you to use it for the first year of marriage or 2 years, and then you have to come back to me. It's like with all of the Catholic Church and we're giving out dispensations. I have no idea how they justify that approach halacha. Anyway, but that's what they say. And then it becomes completely about, I don't trust you. I'm going to, therefore, as my response to not being able to trust you, I'm going to have to try to, use my rabbinic power to get you to do what I think is the right thing to be doing Jewishly. Now, there are some people that completely submit. Maybe they are buy into those values, or maybe they don't know any better. But at least a lot of people I know in the non-Orthodox community, the vast majority, basically, maybe after their first 2 years of marriage, would never ask a rabbi a question about birth control, and actually think it would be like absurd to ask a rabbi a question about birth control. He's not going to give me an answer that is a reasonable one. He's not going to be sensitive to my situation. His values aren't in line with my values. And anyway, why the heck should I actually turn to, think that halacha or a rabbi should dictate how many kids I'm going to have in my family? I mean, this is a real question. Why should halacha, have an answer? Say something about that. It's like a real life decision. And that's at least sort of the way I see a lot of people's attitude. And what that speaks to is exactly what we have lost by focusing on rabbinic authority and just do and not engaging in these conversations about values, and the rabbi's not really trying to working to trust people. Worst thing happens, oh my God, people are going to make a decision for themselves. Guess what? They're doing that anyway. You try to exert this power, basically you've lost them. So why not actually loosen the leash a little bit, trust people, and maybe actually that'll get people more in line with where the values should be, because then you can engage in a conversation around those values about family as opposed to personal advancement and so on, and actually you will restore trust, and people might actually think, you know what, it's not like at some ex-cathedra you're allowed to use birth control X number of years. Talking about, as you said, if all values issues are ultimately halachic issues, if talking to the rabbi about, using birth control becomes a conversation about being reflective on values and being informed by Jewish values and thinking about those issues, then maybe those are conversations I want to have, because it's not about him telling me what to do. It's about him engaging me in this discussion and in this process. So that to me is a perfect paradigm of how things have gone wrong and what we need to do to fix it.
Okay, there's much room for conversation. I'm gonna try and speak. I'm gonna try and speak directly from my own experience, and we can talk about how where the positions differ. So I guess when I went to yeshiva, so this was it was clear that the lenient position was we'll let you use birth control for the first year and then come back. That was the extreme lenient position. And I thought I was being a great liberal when I adopted that position, which was not the position of the of the Rosh Yeshiva, who were generally seen as the great Pasken of the time. And it took a few years later, where first of all, I started getting really negative feedback from people, not from me, but other people who given them that answer, and they felt that answer wasn't what Linzer said. It was just somebody having an excuse to be deeply intrusive in their life. And it really wasn't working. And then I think there was a second deeper problem with it, which really one of my students called me and said, and really just brought it home to me, said, Rabbi, I'm calling you to ask you the birth control question, but I feel ridiculous because I have also read the articles on the subject, and I know that there are a variety of positions on this issue, and of course I would never ask you the question unless I already knew that you adopted a lenient position. So I'm asking you for a heter because I know, and tell me now if you're not. Because if I have mistaken you, I'm not asking you the question. I'll go ask Rabbi so and so. And it's very important to do that because I happen to know of a friend of a student of mine who asked the question to one of my teachers under the impression that he was a liberal and got an answer which said, you have to give up all your career goals right now and become pregnant. And didn't know what to do, right? Because she asked the shaila with tmimus and complete innocence, but didn't really, right? Because they're asking you because of the assumption that they're upright. That so
people who have learned how the game are played to say, I'm just asking you hypothetically. How would you rule in this case?
Right. So I think that one of the limits of halakhic authority we should realize is that nobody can paskin something for somebody else unless you ask the question. So you have to have trust at some level, because I have no way of imposing my authority on anybody. They have to agree to ask me the question. So the challenge is how to build a relationship where somebody might be willing to ask that question, and then whether at the end of the day, once you've gone to the effort of building that relationship, whether you want them to ask the question or you want to throw it back at them. But I think it's an interesting thing in terms of birth control, in terms of the intrusiveness, because it's a little weird to me that people who ask Nida shilas think that birth control is more intrusive. That's right. That's it.
So could I respond to that?
We wait, let that. Okay. Let's. So here, I think that there is, in addition to the intrusive question, I think that we are, for good or for ill, we live in a culture where where birth as women's bodies and psak as a legal system imposing thing on women's bodies, and Orthodox psak, till very recently, at least certainly as male law being imposed on women's bodies, has had a lot of influence in that way. In the same way that I think that, in my experience, Haredi women are much more liberal in abortion than Haredi men, even though this has not been formally surveyed. So my own approach in the end on the birth control question, that I think really the core issue is that if you pasken the issue for the couple, you end up having very little room. Now, I don't think there's as broad room as you have for delay and all that. I think that there's a lot of rhetoric in halachic literature about the importance of fulfilling it rapidly, at least up until pruruvu. On the other hand, what you have is the Meshech Chachma points out that women have no obligation at all. So the mechanical way of going about it is to say that I'm not going to answer the question from the couple. I'm going to answer the question from the woman, and the answer is the woman has no obligation. And then there's no child at all. Right? Then the question is, is the man allowed to marry or remain married? And then the question is, are you more likely to have children that way or not? And usually the answer is yes, that you're more likely to have children by agreeing to use birth control in account of this relationship than by hypothetically waiting for somebody who has. And that has the pragmatic result of responding to that issue. I do think that that we need as a community, granting that I think this is a place for halakha, I think it would be unreasonable or be false not to say that halakha recognizes the value of women's autonomy over their bodies in this regard, and that's why women don't have a chiyuv of pruruvu, and not to mention the Meshech Chachma's formal rationale that it's really dangerous, which is less true. But I also think that to have the whole conversation as if what has happened is a values conversation and not acknowledge that what has happened is a technological shift. That it used to be, people didn't ask these shalas because what are you going to do? You're going to, ultimately, ultimately you didn't have the option of having an unhindered sexual relationship and not having children. We're really dealing with a totally new issue in halakha, which is really effective birth control. And that, so we have the possibility that if we pasken leniently about birth control, we will end up with a less than replacement rate. Which is where the Jewish community as a whole is. Right now, we're less than replacement rate without assimilation. Just straight births. Non-Orthodoxy, we're below replacement rate. So I think we have to figure out, on the one hand, a way in which we honor the halakha, which is that women really do have autonomy, and at the same time recognize that we have to create a sense of communal responsibility where continuity requires having more than 1.8 children, even in an environment with 100% retention. I'm going to say that the joke I was going to put in here is that the two things we have. But I would say that the real thing is day school tuition, obviously.
That's clearly. So I want to first respond to the point about the Nida issue, because I don't think that it's yes, I think intrusiveness and telling me what to do with my body is an issue, and I think that that's why there are women who don't ask rabbis Nida shilas, and I think that's why we're so critical of the whole institution of the Yotzot, and people wouldn't ask a lot more shilas because of that. Probably the women that weren't asking shilas were more often than not, as we discussed earlier, passing the chumrah rather than the kula. So there's definitely an aspect of that. But I want to go back to the point I was making before, which is not just the telling me what to do with my body, it's telling me what to do about something that really matters. And that's, I think, the problem. Why should I let halacha, a rabbi, tell me how many kids I should be having? And I think that, and that's an issue that I want to sort of acknowledge that I think a lot of people feel that way. As I said, that I think halacha can tell me all the questions about which things I'm going to buy for Pesach, about this thing for Shabbos, things that are like important life decisions. Like that's why I raised like the business ethics, the number of children in the family, those types of issues. People feel like that's where they feel the heteronomy. They feel the sense halacha is going to dictate. It's not going to be a discussion of values. It's not going to be something that respects my voice and my issues. And it's going to be anyway, if it's going to be a yes or a no, rather than a conversation and a values and a guidance, then that's exactly not something that I can tolerate in terms of this area of my life. And I think that whether rightly or wrongly, that's how a lot of people feel nowadays because of the realities about autonomy and self-direction and so on, and that we have to do a lot to make those conversations different than the way they are. So the actual issues about some of the substance of what you said about the birth control, I'm not going to address, but I think for me, it's important because of what this signifies in terms of the whole issue. Rabbi seeing the autonomy, seeing people say God doesn't belong in the bedroom, making this choice, or they're afraid that they can't trust the people, and therefore they respond by trying to exert more control rather than by less control and having trust. And that's where I think the work has to be done. I just want to give one brief example, though, about this issue about people think, basically, I want to know that I'm operating the system. I want to be able to, like I think social scientists have found that we make a lot of decisions not because of some abstract principle sense set of, but because of a sense of our identity. Like people will steal a Coke, see a Coke lying around the thing, there's a dollar lying around, they won't take it. And the basic reason is because I can look at myself in the mirror if I took a Coke, and I say, I'm not a thief, look at the Coke lying around. But if I get a dollar, then I can look at myself in the mirror and feel the same way about myself. And I think that has a lot to do with how people, as Orthodox, live their lives. If I wouldn't, go to Shul on Shabbos, if I would do this on Shabbos, I couldn't look myself in the mirror. And so, for example, I had a woman that asked me about going to the mikvah, and it was a whole issue with chatzitza, and I couldn't find any way to allow it. And and I told her, I'm sorry, I think you're going to have to just wait till this thing gets dealt with. And then I find out later that she went ahead and she asked somebody else who she thought she'd get a more lenient answer from. And she was basically shopping around, and I'm saying, so then why didn't you just say, to heck with it, I'm just going to go to the mikvah anyway? Because then she couldn't look at herself in the mirror. She has to be able to say, I'm playing within the game, even if that means keep on shopping around till you get the answer that you want. And I think that that's like what we have to sort of acknowledge is what's going on. People want to play the game, get the answers that they're looking for, or just give me the answer, let me just do that. But the areas that matter in their lives, that's the area where I think where we really have to work at restoring that trust and having more meaningful conversations about halachic values, Torah values, and stuff.
So I just want to push you to be a little more specific on this question. What would it look like? What would you like it to look like? Because it seems to me that in part, both of you, but you in particular, are addressing needs of the community and the ills of the community and what we haven't dealt with in Paskening properly. What ideally would it look like? Someone comes to you on this issue. How do you respond? What would an answer look like ideally? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, the first ideal, though, I will say, is that we've done our job as rabbis and as a community at getting people to ask those questions because they know that they can have a type of an answer that they want, and they understand that those are the more important areas to be asking questions. Not about what hechsher, obviously it's what hechsher, but these are the areas that you need to be asking the questions about. If we've done that work, and then finally people are coming to me and asking those questions, then I think that because in the particular area of it might depend case by case. I mean, in some cases there are red lines, and people, you have to say, look, there's no latitude here. But a case like this, I think that for various reasons, and Rabbi Klapper and I can debate what those reasons are. I think that there's very little red lines in terms of the halacha, but that the rabbi's responsibility and the person's responsibility is to be very reflected in terms of what are the values of the system, what needs to be living a life according to Torah values, and be making decisions, thinking about the different types of competing values, and to help the person in that process. That's what, at least in that case, it would look like. Other cases might have more black and white lines. I do have to tell a short story exactly about this. But I know a rabbi who said, somebody came to me, a couple came to me and said, Rabbi, should we have a baby? He said, I'm not going to give you the answer to that. So they were already asking the question. I'm not going to give you the answer to that. He didn't buy into the, I'll just tell you. So he said, let's learn. So they sat and they learned, the couple and all the things, and they talked about the values and different issues and so on. After 3 months, they said, Rabbi, that was great. So tell us, should we have a baby? So he said, I'm not going to give the answer. Let's learn some more. So they spent 3 more months learning. And at the end of the 3 months, he said, Rabbi, great. Should we have a baby? So he said, at that stage, I figured, look, they're going to keep on asking me. I like kids. I'm not going to have to raise this one. So he said they had a baby, and he was a boy, and they named him after him. So some people, even in those areas, they just tell me what to do.
So I agree entirely. I think that that's like the one takeaway, that we have a breakdown in trust in which rabbis are often, especially in modern Orthodoxy, seen as ways in which you can legitimate your behavior mechanically, right? There are ways you can check that you're in the boundary. But when it comes to issues that really matter, right, issues that require judgment, people are much less happy asking rabbis questions that require judgment. And we need to rebuild trust so that people think of rabbis as a place to ask questions where they recognize that it really matters which way the answer, and not just which way the answer is morally and ethically. I think it's a really interesting question in the context of birth control specifically, whether at the end of the day the product of that regained trust is now you can ask the question and I can tell you, right? Or whether the product of that regained trust is I would never consider telling you what to do, right? And that I'm not sure that I've totally gotten your answer.
In that case, I would say B. Because I don't think the halacha ends with a clear black.
Right. So I think in birth control, right. But I think that here is an issue that underlies some of what we've said, which is whether we want to limit the occasions of some notion of heteronomy to areas of black letter law, or whether really what we want is not heteronomy to legal authority. What we want is people submitting to what the best conception of Torah values is. And so how powerfully will people take rabbinic judgment on issues like that? So I'll say, for example, I've been clear, right, what I think the halachic approach is, but a question that I'm sure that you get often, that I used to get often when I was in a more communal role that way, was we'd like to get married, but you know what, there are issues in the relationship. And we're not sure the marriage is going to last. We don't want to have kids after a short relationship. So can we have a heter at the beginning of the relationship until we're pretty confident that the relationship will work out? Now, I don't think that that's really such a question that should be given black letter law, but I think it's a really important value that rabbis and Torah should be deeply irrelevant to, even if in that the particular case I was first asked, my answer was almost certainly wrong. So I'm wondering, all right, to me that's really the end, is whether we couch it as black letter law in the end. I wouldn't want to say I pasken that, right? No, right? You can't use birth control the first year of marriage, or I pasken. There's one case where another rabbi pasken, I think, was right that it was a chiyuv to use birth control because the chance of the couple surviving was so low that to not use birth control was irresponsible. It was really interesting. It wasn't my psak, but I happily went along with it. But I think those are the kinds that I think that the underlying question is whether we want psak only to apply to issues of black letter law, in which case there really isn't going to be so much psak, because you'll always find somebody, right? We have so much information, there's always going to be some way in which you can legitimate the other option. And how we do that without, often say, like the only time I've ever been shouted down at a public lecture was when I tried to be daring and controversial, and I called a public lecture why modern Orthodoxy should believe in Das Torah. I never got past the first sentence because somebody got up and said it shouldn't.
I should believe in Das Torah.
Right. Now, my point was not that we should believe in unconditional as you get, unconditional submission, but that there should be some notion of authority that goes beyond just what a computer could tell you about the nature of law. And that, right, the boundary, there's always going to be a gray area at the boundaries of what's going on. We should want Torah knowledge to matter to some extent in those areas. And I think that still has to come in with all the safeguards I'm talking about that we should never let charismatics rule.
So I'm just going to briefly respond to all. I think we're totally in agreement in terms of the importance of the values values as a missing part of the conversation. Again, I would push you on the issue about authority. I think a lot of restoring of trust has to be done with that, because the values, if halacha can easily be interpreted in a wide range of possibilities, values are even more amorphous, and so many people say so many things in the name of Torah values. So to think, I do think that we can make strong arguments about what certain values are, but I think that those are much more suspect, and that we have to do an enormous amount to regain a sense that we are actually, that we have what to say in that area. That's not just us reading our own values, into it and then reading them back out. And that I think that the place to start again there is a conversation and pushing back and forth, and not talking about authority in terms of Torah values. So yeah, that will be my response to that.
Okay. I think given that it's 8:20, you should either take another example and a 1-minute answer to what would be a Pesach on this, or we should just open it to questions.
Well, let me throw out a brief example that's on my mind that's similar to this. Okay, very brief, okay, which gets to this issue, something that is a Pesach, but also something that, people might not get to. So, I have a pretty strict position about going into like a Catholic church, particularly the sanctuary room in halacha, to allow it. And one of the reasons that I have the position is I think it's where the weight of all of the Pasken have been traditionally. So it's strict halachic reasons, but also because I think that in an age of pluralism, we tend to be very relativist about our own belief systems. And we say, I do this, I do that, you do that. More or less, it's all the same. Like belief doesn't really matter so much. And we don't really think that there's deep importance to those things, and that to actually have certain things like taboo, in a place of a different faith that is a type of a belief that I feel is in some ways antithetical, always, but in certain areas, that actually is important in terms of our own relationship to that our own faith really matter. So that's my position. So anyway, somebody, the question about can I go to a church, with my colleague, a funeral, a wedding, etc. And this person was going to go anyway. It didn't matter what I said. They had to go. It was their work colleague. But I shared with them. I didn't say it's us or this would be my Pesach, and let me tell you why. And I shared these values. And the person, I don't think he did anything different, but he said that his response was, wow, like I really got to think about that. And that's where the type of conversation I think we have to have.
So it's a fascinating discussion. We can have it in number 5. About I think my general practice when somebody comes and asks me a shayla, unless I have a long-standing relationship with them, where I think they really understand where I'm coming from, is to say, do you really want to ask this as a shayla? Right. So it's right. So almost never, right? If somebody leaves it open as to whether they're asking it for my authority or not, I almost never say impose my authority on them. So I think that is. I do think that that is an example of the kind of issue, however, where sometimes, and I don't think it's a complete failure, I don't think it's a failure at all, really, if the answer is, yeah, no, actually, what I want in such a case, right? That's where I guess keep pushing, is that there's some kinds of issues where at the end of the day, if somebody asks me to make a decision for them, that's a failure, because it means that they haven't actually taken responsibility. And on other kinds of issues, it's a success, because actually they're not at the point where they should be making that decision for themselves, or it would be a tremendous teaching opportunity for them to say, you know what, on this one, I want your decision to be the paradigm for where I want to be. It's an incredible burden on me, but I think it's fair for them to ask that. And that is actually the kind of question where, for some people, I would think that the right outcome is to ask a shayla. For other people, if they're going to do what they do anyway. So again, it's just like either to Pasken for somebody if they're going to do it anyway. Right.
Should we take questions?
Sure. You're in charge.
Yeah. No, first hand.
I'd like to stand up for those of us who ask the question of the answer from the perspective of I don't want to engage, but from the perspective of I have engaged on my own, and there are so many different viewpoints, and I do not have enough knowledge. I know that I do not have enough knowledge to sort out which one is the best one. And so I come to the rabbi and I say, just please tell me, is this for an example, is Corella glass?
Right.
There are so many answers on that
Right.
that I don't know whether I can use my bowl.
Right.
And I don't want to accidentally use
Right.
a bowl that is treif.
Right.
But I know that I don't have the knowledge to figure that one out.
Right. So I want to, first of all, ask Mechila if I've offended anybody. That was a generalization. And I also want to go back, and maybe I wasn't clear the first time I said this, but I actually think that it's totally okay to say that my whole relationship to this particular area is I got to keep kosher, right? I don't want to have larger, deeper conversations of the meaning of kashrus, and that's not where I get religious meaning from. But I do need to know all of the little details because all the little details matter to me, and I'm committed to keeping kosher fully. So there, I think just tell me the answer is completely legitimate. My concern is that if that's like the entire relationship to all areas of halacha, but I completely agree that there are some areas where our basic relationship is punctilious observance is the primary thing here that matters, and therefore I just and I need to know the specifics.
I would say that there isn't a right thing to do in that case, because Corella's glass, according to some poskim, not according to that my decision, right, is the determinative decision and not Rav Bush's or Shlomo Zalman's, thing like that. So the notion that what does my psak make a difference, right? If you already have all these options, right? So the only difference that asking, and that they're both right. That if you call it glass, you'll be following Rabbi X, and if you call it not glass, you'll be following Rabbi Y. So either way, you're not going to be using something that is objectively treif, or you're not or my psak is not going to make it objectively treif for you. So I think that those kind of issues more, and this is really, when there are a range of options, what we want is for people to be able to eat safely in each other's kitchens. And so there was a value for having the Rav of the community determine the kashrus standards for the community so that everybody can know. Now, the problem right now is that you're asking your shaila to me, say, right? But the person next to you is asking the shaila to Rabbi Linzer. The person after that is asking the question to Rabbi Berman, right? The person after that is asking the shaila to your Rosh Hashiva and Eretz Yisrael, right? And somebody else is calling you answer hotline illegally and asking a kashrus shaila. So I'm not at all sure right now. Where that the proper answer is to that question isn't. Unless if you're bound by my psak generally, so you have halachic legitimacy in saying, I always follow your psak, I always follow your psak by Linzer, and so this is part of my religious consistency. So I will treat Corella as X, and I'll also follow your chumras. I'll use the right number of dishwashers and depending on which kind of soap, and I will or I won't kasher the china I inherited from great aunt Sadie who didn't keep kosher, or his triangle K or whatever, right? So I think there's but if the answer is I looked in the art scroll book and the art scroll book said Corella's glass, except some say it isn't. And you eclectically call whoever, you look up the yellow pages, where we've all paid for our ads, and the rotating ad today is Rabbi Linzer. I'm not sure I see what the rabbi is doing, other than, there's to some degree, there's always a class argument as to how you pay rabbi salaries. So perhaps nowadays we earn our salaries by making people not feel guilty.
Let me just, I know there's a lot of other questions, but I want to reflect a second about what I do think is happening when somebody asks even a random rabbi about that, and I think goes back to the question of how I see people relating to the system. Because if I see that there are these opinions out there, this exactly gets to the question of paskening for yourself. If I were to choose one, it would not feel like I'm playing by the rules of the game, because I don't have any good basis for choosing one over the other, so it feels like I'm cheating, whether I'm being too strict or too lenient, right? But if I ask a rabbi who's invested with that authority, then I'm playing by the rules of the game. Then, for whatever, even if it was a random rabbi. And I actually do think that that's why it makes a difference for a lot of people in terms of the way they relate to the entire sort of system and the hesitancy to pasken for oneself. I think is a part of it.
But should we allow those two?
I don't know, but I'm trying to explain where I think that's coming from.
I think it's true.
I still don't know if I can use my bowl.
We're not,
theoretically, Rabbi Klapper, what would it be?
we're not paskening for anybody here.
I wasn't actually.
I was wondering about areas that are less or those questions where it really seems very subjective to maybe even the authority of the community. Like the rabbi in that sense can reflect the values of the community that then might dictate the halacha. So I guess my question, if I were to use an example, like I think Kisei Rosh is a big issue in that sense. Like, where different communities have different expectations. How do you then treat the rabbi when a couple comes or when a woman comes and asks that question? What role is the rabbi playing when he answers her question about that?
So, I think that's another perfect example where the rabbi is, even if and like, I do not think the correct approach is let me understand you, let me understand the community, and then let me pass it for you. That's a case where I think that it's really about the person's the whole sense of who they are, their identity, their relationship to the community, issues about dress and hair and whatever, those are very important to a person's sense of self. And I would lay out the positions, and I would say to the person, here are the different issues that are going on. You have to give, and here are the different values that are at stake, and you have to give some real thought to this in terms of what does it say in terms of your relationship to past generations, your current community, the community you want to associate with. How do you feel about rabbinic authority imposing on your body and men, sort of dictating and so on? Maybe don't feel bad about that. But if those were issues, and I would try to raise all the various issues and lay out the halachic questions and sort of encourage the person to really make the decision that is right for them. If the person came to me and said, "But Rabbi, just tell me what to do," like the birth control question, where they just have nothing to tell me, then I would work with the person, but I'm not sure at the end of the day I would say this is what you should do. I would say, given everything you're telling me, it seems to me that this position is the one that fits best with with where you're coming from. So but that isn't a place where I specifically would, because it is so personal and because there are the range of positions, I would really be reluctant. But not reluctant, I would not, I don't think I would possibly for somebody black and white enough.
So at the end of the day, I think that it's, I guess what I would emphasize again is that in America, in the world we live in, the relationship between a shoel and a posek is always voluntary. So, so I think I do exactly the same things Rabbi Linzer said, it's a question within certain parameters, right? I might tell people, what, but you should know that if you're looking for this answer, right? So I cannot with integrity list that as but if the answer you want is you have to shave your head, for example, right? So I can't with integrity tell you that's really right. That's really the psak I'm going to give. But at the end of the day, if after we went through that, somebody said, okay, so I know there's a range of options, and I know that we're functioning within the same community, but at the same time, I want to, part of my understanding of the rules of the game is that I'm supposed to develop some degree of consistency. And the person, so I want you to tell me what I have to do. So under those circumstances, again, I'm not somebody who, it gives me, psak gives me gray hairs because I'm wrong, and I've been wrong, then it's my responsibility in the morning and not theirs. But in the end, if that comes down to it, particularly in cases like that, where I think you're dealing often in the context of a relationship, and so you need to say, I asked somebody else, right? Because in the context of relationship, in the context of your community, right? It's often part of the job of rabbis. So the minimal way is so people won't feel guilty about their own decisions. But part of the job of rabbis is to give cover to people, in the name of other people. So I think as a campus rabbi, a big part of my job was to be the crazy person that Balei Tshuva could have their parents call. Right. So I think that in those circumstances, particularly hair covering, which is negotiated in a relationship, but at the end of the day, often it's often I think that is part of the job of posek is to remove that question from the realm of the negotiation and the relationship. And so if people wanted to ask a child at the end of the day, I think that I would be obligated to answer.
I just want to add one brief thing about the point, because it's a very important point that I want to underscore about that people sometimes need the rabbi to Pasken because they need to, have somebody help them make the decision that they know is the right one, and that they can't fully own that decision on their own, whether it's an issue of guilt or whether it's just such a hard decision, and that sometimes the rabbi actually has to, exert his authority because that's exactly what the person needs for them to come to the decision that they know that they need to come to. I mean, I had a question about a woman who, about an abortion issue, and it was within the first 40 days, and there was a lot of extenuating circumstances where it was clear that this woman needed to have an abortion. But she needed me to tell her, you actually have to have an abortion, because it was not enough for me to say, well, this is a decision you're going to have to make based on these issues. It was clear that that was the answer she needed, that halacha would demand it, that she herself knew she wanted, but that she actually needed me to help her do that by taking some of the responsibility, on myself. So I think that we should acknowledge that's a very important part that a rabbi plays.
Jen?
I actually wanted to follow up on that and add an additional important part that the simple just tell me what's the model is not necessarily that responsibility. Going to the example you gave of somebody asking about doing something, who was asking the question may have the answer. But it's an awful lot easier to be able to say to your Catholic neighbor, I'm sorry, I can't attend your child's first communion because the rabbi said.
That's an excellent point, right?
They're coming from a model where that has authority. You can turn around and say something like, because the Torah says, or I think the Torah says, now you've done something to them. And that's an important role of the just giving an answer.
Right. I fully agree.
All right, I'm going to move around the room this way, sir.
Yes. I'd like to broaden the discussion and talk about more of a community congregational aspect. When I look at the Orthodox, and I'm generalizing Orthodox rabbis, and I see the lack of discussion, as you mentioned, about business ethics and medical ethics, and I look at the lack of discussion on the meaning of life, the discussions of the centrality of Job and Ecclesiastes, and I look at the politicization of the holidays and how politics in Israel is so pervasive. I see much more pervasive now in the Jewish Jewish community and in religious life than it has been in the last 20 years. And I see that in the Orthodox community, whereas I look at the conservative viewpoint, the lack of discussions of the halacha and the laws, and I see the relevance and trying to take that law and show people the relevance of that in today's current events and look at that and try to have people make important, valuable, value-laden decisions. And I see this bifurcation and when I go to Orthodox and conservative congregations, the left on the one hand versus the other. But I see some very important problems as you've raised here with looking at values. I never see any of the comments you made about business. If we had a discussion on business ethics, we'd have to change the whole capitalist system.
Right.
That's my comment.
I don't know what to respond other than I think what your last point points to is that one of the reasons we avoid the discussion about values and we narrowed ourselves to only a halachic language. I think there's two reasons. One is because values demand more of a commitment for us and it's more pervasive in all areas of life. But I think that the other reason is because we feel we know that if we were to engage in the values discussion, we would find ourselves at odds with some of the values that seem to be expressed in some areas of the system. Like you mentioned, the business and how much does that conform with our capitalistic society. And therefore, it's easier just to talk a halachic language and a halachic language that is bereft of a values discussion. And I think that's part of what I'm trying to articulate is where we need a correction.
I just spent yesterday teaching the halakha on severance day as the entree to a conversation about what employment ethics should be. Right. So I think that you're right that our conversations about these issues have been impoverished so far. Let's change it.
I'm going to go all the way back. Yeah.
I think we've talked a number of times about the cases where people are having already made up their minds, and I just would love to get clarity. In a case where she's going to the fun Tuesday night, she's going into that church. Is there a difference between making that decision on the person's own, shopping for the right prospect, or shopping in a book for a minority opinion that supports that, or are those sort of all halakhically and ethically? Is there something really actually different about each of those? And if there is a difference, is there a preference between those three kinds of? Given that you'd rather have the moral values conversation, all those things, in that case, are those three things the same, or are there differences?
It's interesting. So just to reframe, the question is, I've already decided I'm going to my colleague's wedding in the church.
Yeah.
So do I just go ahead and do it? Or do I ask Rabbi and whatever he says I do it? Or do I keep on shopping around until I get the right answer?
No, the ask Rabbi, and actually this is the Rabbi asking off the table.
Okay.
I've already.
No. I mean, I'm going to ask the Rabbi, and whatever he tells me, I'm going to do it anyway, but I'll just first ask the
So
Rabbi.
that's also possible.
Okay, or do I keep on shopping around until I get the answer? Does it matter which of those three the person chooses?
I was saying, the three I'm curious about is the case where the person has made up their mind, they're either going to do it all on their own, or they're going to shop for a posting, or they're going to shop in a book. And are those all the same, or they're real?
That's an interesting question. Wanna give that
Yeah.
So I think if you made up your mind before you looked for the book, so I'm not quite sure, right, what the book is doing. And I think that if you ask the rabbi the question, so rabbis should know. It's one of the first things I learned in Tzak. I learned it from Rabbi Goritz, the recent rabbi in Israel. It's one of the first I was ever involved in, where somebody came and asked him Shaila, and his first question was, "Will you listen if I say no?" And the person involved said, "No, I won't listen." He said, "Well, then I won't answer." And I think that was right. I don't think you should lend your authority to people who aren't going to listen anyway. The challenge there is, though, is it really true? All right. So in circumstances where you know in advance that there is a position, right? You're just going to the rabbis at the end of the day. So that seems to me kind of silly, unless you're open to the possibility that if I can't find any gosh darn rabbi, there's one answer, then I'll have to reconsider if none of the rabbis I respect are willing to say that. So that would, I think rabbis should not give you the answer you want as psak in those circumstances. I think that's using them, right, to call it right, to give the answer you already want, unless it's an answer they deeply believe in and they're willing to do that. But I would tend to, I think the conversation to have there is, so why are you calling me? Right, as you're calling me because you understand that perhaps there's something here, and that should be the entree to the conversation. But at the end of the day, rabbis shouldn't Pasken questions for people who aren't going to listen.
Wait, I didn't understand. I'll answer, because I didn't understand that was the question. The rabbi could be completely ignorant. The person is the lay person is saying, should I just go ahead and do it, or should I call 10 rabbis till I get the answer I want? And the rabbi's totally in the dark. The rabbi thinks he's the only one being asked, and the person's going to listen to him. So if that's the question, so basically, it to me, what you're posing as as I sort of see what's the choice between is being honest that you're operating outside the system, and or giving up the integrity of the process in order, but still operating technically in some way within the system. And does that sort of undermine your whole integrity in your relationship to the law? If I had to choose between the two, I would choose the latter, and I'll tell you why. Because I think that once I tell myself, like I sort of said before, when something matters, I'm going to do what I need to do, then you're just opening up the door to doing that in a wide range of things, and you're putting yourself, at least in this one case, outside of the system. Halacha is not always going to dictate for you. Whereas if I play the game, even if I sort of cheat or like play the game without full integrity, I'm still reaffirming that even at the boundaries, even by cheating a little bit, but still I operate within the halachic system. So if I had to choose between those two, I don't know if it matters calling rabbis or looking in a book. Either way, it's saying I'm going to find a way to make it work, but I'm still going to play the game. I'm going to still position myself within the halachic system. So to me, that's the one I would choose.
I would go for looking at books, but I don't like calling rabbis under false pretenses, and I also worry that it will breed cynicism. Right? It will reinforce the position that halacha doesn't really have anything serious to say, and I'm not bound by any notion of consistency. So I'm not sure.
So you would say the person should rather step out rather than be sort of adopt a more cynical cheat the system approach.
I'm not saying as an abstraction, right? I think it depends on the person. For some people, the moment when there's the famous story about the Slovakia guys who decide they don't believe in God, but it takes them 23 hours on Shabbos to be able to flip the switch, right? So if this is going to be your flip the switch moment, so then call. But if it's not going to be your flip the switch moment, right? It's just right. I think that's one of the issues I would tell you to Pasken it for yourself.
That's a really good question.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cheating a little bit. So I think that's sort of on a philosophical level. There are a couple of different things going on here. One is the democratic shift, the democratic and autonomous shift in particularly contemporary America, but that's in general, that has cast all of this authority under great light of suspicion, and not just the practices of corruption, terrible things like that, but there's actually like a deep philosophical critique that's happening here. And then I think the other thing that feeds in to the cynicism is the sense of the mechanization of halakha, right? That sort of, we all live in a halakhnocracy, right? We basically like have books that can tell us all the things that we need to do. Many of us have the ability to read them or can call friends who can read them for us. So why should we bother, right? There's no integrity, there's no values, there's no nothing, right? And so at the end of the day, like, I can vote for whoever I want, I can do whatever I want, right? Whatever the emotional pull is to be part of this community starts to crumble, right? So I wonder if you have a sort of vision for how to solve those problems of sort of that mechanism and the challenge of autonomy in America.
So I'll start by saying I think that you did an excellent job at articulating on some of the issues that I was intending to articulate, or hoping I articulated, and that's exactly why I think that that the engagement in conversation and the engagement around the values is a way of addressing both of those. And if it's more about, like, there are times, as we've been discussing, just tell me the answer is absolutely the appropriate mode, but there are a lot of times in which that there's a lot of suspicion of authority, and it has to be more about empowerment and conversation, and not about just, tell me the answer, and that the discussion of the values, and not just say, oh, it's a technical answer. Again, sometimes it is a technical answer, but I think that is the corrective. So that's so the issues that you laid out were exactly some of the points that I was hoping to get out by talking about the need, at least in many circumstances, not all, to be shifting the rabbi's role is just here's the psak, as opposed to let's talk about it.
I had the privilege of teaching a young man named Jonathan Ziering for a number of summers in my program, who happy to say knows vastly more Torah than I do. And so one of the things that interests me preparing for this session, so I listened to his audio share, and I got a source sheet, one of which quotes me, so it's kind of fun. On this issue, but I think it's instructive because his conversation on asking for yourself revolves around three questions. One, where Linzer talked about, which is self-interest. But the first one, really, the two key issues he talks about are, one is what constitutes a technical hurrah, and the second is there's a technically sort of being moreh halacha b'fnei rabcha. Right, Pasken in front of your teeth. So the first hurrah is a formal halachic ruling, right, as opposed to just telling people what, because I looked up in a book also. And then there's a second issue, which is you're not allowed to make whatever the hurrah is. You can't do it in front of your teacher. Can you do it in the lifetime of your teacher in many circumstances? Now, we have managed to have this whole conversation without raising either of these issues. Now, the reason that we can do that is that in many ways, both phenomena can be seen as obsolete, because a hurrah generally deals with a case of first impression. Right, whereas now everything's on the internet somewhere. Right, Google's Pasken everything in some ways. And secondly, and the meta things that also you can find people who have been machria, right, and have decided which of two positions to win both ways. So the notion, right, that you're really deciding the law is illusory. Right, no rabbi is deciding the law will exist outside them, and that we tend not to have those kind of long-term intense relationships with teachers such that they become our teacher. And this is, and connecting the two problems, right? Rav Shefter is fond of quoting the Divrei Tshuva that says nowadays the halakha that you can't Pasken halakha in front of your teacher means you can't do it without looking at books, because our books are our teachers. Oh. Right. So I think, we need to figure out, right? In some ways, this is parallel to the general postmodern relativistic problem, right? So we live in a halachically relativistic world because there are so many options that seem reasonable to us on every issue, and the atomization of education, right, means that it's not outright. We don't understand why one person should have authority because we don't resonate particularly with any one person. We don't have that depth mentoring relationship. I think that's a really deep issue which we have not addressed. So Linzer and I are both talking about trying to create values conversations. The values conversations that take place when someone calls you are not the same as a values conversation that takes place in the context of a 12-year, intense relationship. And I don't think we've really come up with a really good solution as to how to constitute authority, in that realm.
Should we do one more question?
So what I'm thinking
very
is,
briefly,
what I'm
and
thinking
then-
is maybe what we could do is take like 3 or 4 questions and all at once, and then we'll have some final reflections of those questions. Give speaker
Okay,
a last
let's
chance.
do that.
To leave if they want to
Yes.
leave.
Now would be a good time if people are desperate to leave.
We're going to wrap up in the
Continue
next. We'll wrap
for-
up in the next 5 minutes. We'll take 3 or 4 questions, and then we'll give.
Right, but we can also turn our backs and you can work with it.
All right,
Or you could just
so-
ask us whether you're allowed to.
So,
Just tell me how to. We're going to take 2 or 3 questions, and you're going to answer them all.
And wrap it into closing comments.
Okay.
Okay.
So let me tell you what I was imagining was going to happen when I heard the topic and I came here. What I thought it was going to happen. I don't know what I was dreaming would happen, but I kind of envision it something like I've had some experiences with doctors where family issues had some medical choices had to be made and decisions had to be made. I'm the kind of person who kind of reads obsessively, and I would read the journal articles and get everyone's advice and see what the discussion groups. I would go to the doctor and say, I think this is what is the right thing to do. And what did I want? I wanted the doctor to listen to me, but I also wanted the doctor to say, wait a minute, you don't want that. If I was saying something that was off, I needed to be checked. Because if I were making medical decisions on my own without medical training, be a high probability that there'd be a catastrophe or something, right? I needed to be controlled and guided, right? I wanted to be listened to, I wanted to be respected, and I wanted the doctor to respect that I had looked into it and I understood the issue, but I also wanted him to tell me if I was making a big mistake. Or if I was thinking along the right lines, I wanted to see him nod his head, So I've had some of those analogous experiences with questions. I have whatever books I happen to have on my shelf at home, that's what I have. And, whatever ability to read them, that's the ability I have. So an issue comes up and I take down the books I have and I look at it and I say, oh, I think I know what the right thing to do is. And I want to, if I'm going to call a rabbi, I want the rabbi kind of to respect that I've looked into this, in some way, and that, and have that level of conversation with me. And I also want the rabbi to tell me, no, you don't have it right. And I don't know, when can we pasken for ourselves? Somehow, I envision you would tell me the answer to that. I don't know what would have counted as an answer, but
You'll have to pasken for yourself.
Okay.
Okay.
Nomi, you had a question?
Well, I think at this point it's more of a musing really than a question, but a couple of things. First of all, there's something rabbinical side rather than the Goel side in this modern Orthodox construct. And I think that for many of us in this room, that hasn't necessarily been our experience. We have been informed by the idea that everything we do, be it our secular work, be it our conversations with people Jewish and non-Jewish, that the consciousness of what God wants from us and what the right thing is something that's very much with us, and that we are far from asking the questions, but are also very far from having this whole section of our life that we simply say, halacha has no bearing or should have no bearing on it. So that's, I don't know if others in the room agree with me, but I think I'm getting a little bit of agreement here. I think that in that vein, I would say that vision and what you said, you don't know how to solve it, in a way that feels to me connected. First of all, it's sort of an educational mission, in a way, starting from very young in life, I think, but certainly permeating. And in some ways, I think Baalei Tshuva, who come to religion in a certain way, carry that with them much more than so-called FFB. Don't always get that, by the way. And that's something I recently read about, I think, in Aryeh. It's not just other people's depression, it's not statistical, but I think there's something to that. The other thing I wanted to say really, you, Rabbi Klapper, touched on at the end, and I think many other people touched on in one way or another. As I age, I learned to my discomfort that psak is very complicated and incredibly personal very often. And really is, and as you describe examples, a lot of extra halachic issues with particular people involved and so on. Now, what made that halachic paskening relationship so powerful, and I think still holds, is the things that you said. Either you had some rabbi that you had a relationship with, or in the yeshiva, or you were with them for many, many years. Or the rabbi b'kehillah had some kind of real authority for reasons like being able to eat at someone else's house, sometimes for reasons of a towering intellect, piety, intimidation factor. That one isn't good, but there was something about, you know, a rabbi in that kind of configuration. And then I think that what we still have is rabbis who are experts in things. When Jesse went to work on the Eruv, he went to Rabbi in because he was the Eruv man. And that is, those are the sorts of authorities that like a physician has. And I think that's harder. Community don't have those sorts of relationships. And I even think that what part of what you were describing, this kind of modern wish for pure autonomy, but also the sense that you're describing that so many people just want an answer, make those relationships almost unattainable. And that in some ways, this is because the peacekeeping have to be so personal, the random rabbi question almost doesn't work. There's certain types of questions you could probably get a definite psak to. That's me, sorry. I thought that battery. Can you do, you know, can you, like, probably anyone can tell you, can you cook a gedi b'chalei v'mo? That you probably, you know, that doesn't fall into this category, but there isn't a lot of psak that's that definitive, that cut and dry. And there seems to be a spectrum that you've described of from that cut and dry to much more complex, emotional, and other things. And I really hope that it's not always the case that people only bring to it the wish to toe the line, and that the rabbis aren't feeling that, because that only makes it worse. And that these ways of creating relationship with rabbis, which seem to be gone, I even think saying the rabbi, do you ask your rabbi? You ask your rabbi if your rabbi is someone who you built a relationship with, or who you deeply respect for their knowledge, or you've chosen the community because of this person, or because they know they have a specialty. You don't go to a gastroenterologist when you have breast cancer, you know? And
great.
I feel like
I'll just tag on to that. As a woman, it's building a relationship with a rabbi who you respect or especially who you really look up to is very hard, because you're not davening with them 3 times a day, and they don't know you really well, and they can only tell you from across the sheets or the finish room the kind of person they may think you are.
So
Can you wrap that into a closing
yes, I
statement?
think I can. I think that those were really good. I think those were really good ending comments. So let me try to sort of address them and wrap them up. I think that what we heard here at the end was very important. A theme from both of them, from both comments, which is, you know, there's been a lot of conversation of, if I can find all the answers in the books, then why do I have to talk to a rabbi? And what both of these sort of point to is, you know, is that we fool ourselves. Like, I would hope that if my guys are going for 4 years in smicha, that they're actually learning something that you can't about process and depth and nuance, and a type of things that cannot just be reduced to a list of menu options and pick the one that fits for you. So I really appreciate the point that was made about you know, the balance between in being invested, being empowered, researching it yourself, but not thinking that that means that you get to 4 years of medical school and 4 years of internship and residency, and that actually even with reading everything on the internet, not everything is as legitimate as everything else, and not everything is as appropriate to you as everything else, and that actually there's a reason that the rabbi has been trained and that he actually, needs to his voice is so critical in that process. So I think what was put out there in terms of a very nice balancing of empowerment and investment and involvement, but respecting, and I really appreciate it, because I think too much, at least for me, there was a message like, well, if I know all the options and I can read it on the internet, then what else is needed? And that, you can read a lot of things on the internet, things about whether vaccines really, we should do vaccines or not. So there's a lot that is really, that, the rabbi does bring to the table, and that, through the training, and that also gets to the real issues that were made about the very personal nature of psak, and how much it is very personal. So I think that that's a very healthy way of like talking about an appropriate type of a balance. And I also appreciate the point that maybe I do a little bit too quick of a picture. I want to say that, first of all, it's thrilling to hear that what you express, and I personally don't hear that enough.
Come back to Boston.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, maybe it has to do with the lasting influence of the Rav. Maybe it has to do with the fact that when you have sort of smaller, more intimate communities, those types of attitudes and values can get cultivated in ways that a more cosmopolitan type of a scenario like New York and so on doesn't happen. And I also do want to say that, again, I hope I didn't offend anybody or make things look too bleak, but I think the positive thing of me, I will admit, sometimes I focus on, oh, this is such a problem, and maybe overstate it. But I think the positive part about that is that to me serves as an impetus for trying to make things that much better. And I hope that even if what I said doesn't fully ring true, that if people see a truth, an element of truth there, that we can think about the areas that we actually do need to all work better on in terms of making both our relationship to the rabbi and our relationship to halacha and our relationship to the larger sense of Torah and Torah values, one that is, that is as full and complete as it needs to be.
So first of all, thank you. That was
Thank you.
That was beautiful. I love speaking here, and you should appreciate.
I'm back again.
You should appreciate living in a community, right, where you can feel not an island if you're doing that. And to some degree, we right, the halachic scholarly communities do a better job of being responsive to people who want their whole lives to be permeated by Torah. I also think that we should de-emphasize the title of rabbi and talk about the Talmidei Chachamim. We should acknowledge that not all rabbis are capable of psak, and many people who don't have smicha nonetheless have great Torah knowledge and perhaps are great resources, leaving aside gender. I guess I would put up with 50, even like there are even small cosmopolitan communities also.
Yeah, Boston is not so.
I'd say like Boston,
so isolated as a community.
Right, here in the
here in the Hicks, right?
Luxury town of Cambridge, right? We always felt that way. Only we could be in New York. The last thing I guess I would say is I think two underlying messages which we really share. One is the notion that the ideal circumstance is not one of blank question, right, of denuded question and black white answer. It has to arise out of a relationship. That relationship should be one that involves real discussion in Torah. The second, if I can still stick to some degree to my philosophic perspective, is that we want halachic authorities who don't want authority, because part of the motive to learn should be the capacity to make decisions in accordance and to live Torah the way that matters most to you on a deepest level. And you should never want other people to live through you, right, and to live God's word through you as opposed to others. And so a second element of restoring trust, and I want to argue that to some degree this is part of the foundation of Judaism. It's why God takes Avraham Avinu, because Avraham Avinu's reaction to getting prophecy is not to say, well, now I know what God wants and you should all bring me lots of stuff, right, so I can get God, right, so I can get God to do it. It's to share, right? It's to share the word of God. So when we have rabbis whose ambition is to raise everybody they are talking to the level where at least it should be mutual, you should be asking each other questions, right, and for whom the life experience of other people is a value to them, so they feel that they're learning in the conversation and not just teaching. then I think that can create a virtuous cycle where it makes the authority against their will to some degree possible again.
Thank you. Give me 30 seconds. Clap, yeah. And as we conclude, I just wanted to say, sorry, Shauna, 30 seconds. Just three quick, or 5 quick thank yous. First to Rabbi Klapper and the Center for Modern Torah Leadership, and to Rabbi Linzer and Yeshivat Chovevei Torah Rabbinical School, to Ann Geller and Congregation Kadima Torah Moshe,
To Rabbi Berman and
and as part of that as well, just to thank Brana Dudge, who's with us from Center for Modern Torah Leadership, and Esther Neder from Kadima, both of whom did a lot of work behind the scenes to make this all work out so nicely tonight. So thank you both as well. In conclusion, I had something on my mind, and it was sort of implied throughout the conversation. Rabbi Klapper, you really brought it home just now, sort of saying this, which is the sense that, and it's a word that hasn't been used tonight, if I recall correctly. We'll have to go back to the tape afterwards and find out for sure. Surprisingly, in a topic where we're talking so much about authority, about autonomy, about all these different things, there was a tremendous amount of humility in the conversation as well, from the 3 people who sat up here and had this conversation. And so I wanted to thank them for that, for teaching us a tremendous amount, and for inspiring us, and for so many members of the audience through their questions as well, for inspiring us to think about our relationship with halakha, our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and our relationship with our communities in Torah. Thank you all. Have a wonderful night. Next Shabbat, Rabbi Jeremy Stern is going to be here from the Organization for the Resolution of Autonomy in a week and a half. There are flyers, green flyers over there, as well as some other flyers from Chovevei. Hey, have a wonderful night. Shop me tomorrow morning at 10 to 7.
I think it's valuable to see different approaches.